There you go.
There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Tracy McIntyre. I'm the lead educator with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I am here with my colleague, Melissa Wynn, who's Director of Marketing and Communications. She's going to be handling a lot of the techie stuff. And I am very pleased to welcome this evening author Stephen Budiansky. And we are going to be talking about his book, A Day in September, The Battle of Antietam and the World It Left Behind. We are currently selling this book in our bookstore. So if you are intrigued by this talk, please feel free to log on to our website and you're welcome to order the book through our website. I'm going to give it over to Stephen now. I'm going to ask him, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for doing this.
Good
I
evening.
would like I would like you to, if you would, give us a little bit of a background about yourself, where you're from, and a little bit about your education, and what got you started in writing.
Well, like all writers and journalists, I took a very roundabout route to where I've ended up now. I started out I'm from Lexington, Massachusetts. I started out as a science writer. I worked for Nature, the scientific journal. I worked for 12 years for U.S. News and World Report magazine, if anyone remembers that from the old days
Yes, I do.
news magazines. And then I started writing books. So that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years on a lot of different topics. History has been a constant thread. And I really got interested in military history in the year I spent between Nature and U.S. News, where I worked for the U.S. Congress for 1 year on a project looking at some very complex questions about nuclear deterrence and NATO's posture and advanced conventional weapons. And I just started reading an awful lot and then writing about it. So this book, in a way, although its focus is the Battle of Antietam and its place in American culture, its impact on American society and culture, in some ways, I really tried to bring in 30 years or so of writing and thinking and researching about war in general and war's place in society. So I really tried to put the events of Antietam and the 9 people I looked at in this broader context of trying to understand, what war is, what it does to people, what it reveals about the societies in which it takes place.
Great. Well, I have to interject here. I was born in Concord, Massachusetts,
Oh, all right.
so we're sort of kind of
Practically
neighbors.
neighbors. Yeah.
You got it. You got it.
Lexington is the place where the American Revolution actually began, even though Concord always
Exactly.
likes to claim that.
Concord claims the shot heard round the world, but
Yeah.
Lexington claims the first shot. So yes, indeed, I'm familiar with that little rivalry going on there. But yes, I was interested to read some of the. Well, I haven't read all of the books that you've written, but I have a friend who is very excited that I was interviewing you because he loved your book Code Warriors about World War II. And I think it's really interesting that you're sort of branching out in all areas of history, all eras of history. Was there something particular that got you interested in the story of Antietam or in the Civil War?
Yeah, this is one of those problematic questions people always ask authors this. How did you get the idea for this book? And of course, the honest answer, if you're someone like me who does this for a living, is I needed to pay the light bill. I mean, but I mean, seriously, if you do what I've done, you're always thinking about possible new ideas. So it's hard for me to really pinpoint, the actual genesis of this book. But one of the things certainly was when I wrote my biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., he was at the Battle of Antietam. The Civil War was a huge shaping force in his life. And you see this, what an impact this had on him as a young man. And you can see in his judicial philosophy as a member of the Supreme Court for so many years, you see the kind of, um, in one of his famous speeches to a reunion of veterans, he said, "We know the passion and irony of life, those who went through what we did and somehow survived." And that really struck me. And I think you really see this with him and so many of that generation. So that was on my mind. And I thought, and at some point I started noticing, my goodness, there's so many people who came together at this one place in this one day. So many different, consequences. You had, I mean, your museum opened my eyes to here's Jonathan Letterman, where, uh, a turning point in the entire history of military medicine, where he's instituting really the sort of whole framework of modern battlefield medicine right here. It's extraordinary. You have Clara
Yes.
Barton there, you have Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation as a result of it. And in looking for, some way to think about this, to cast it, a metaphor for this, I came across Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.'s writing about Antietam, and he said he wrote this long piece in the Atlantic about searching for his wounded son after Antietam. His wounded son was furious about the piece being written. He felt his father was exploiting, his real experiences here and turning it into this sort of melodrama and turning it all about his father. Hunt, it was called My Hunt for the Captain. But Holmes Sr. describes approaching the battlefield of Antietam. He's managed to hire a horse and wagon at Frederick and be driven out to the battlefield. And he starts seeing the signs of devastation of, all the fence rails down where soldiers had used that for campfires and the signs of the armies passing through and what had been left in their wake. And he said it was like one of those tornadoes that passes through a town and leaves this path of destruction. But then shifting the metaphor, he says um, it's like a vortex, he said, that sucks in everything from the surrounding area and then it spews it back out. And I thought, yeah, we're still feeling the ripples of these, waves in all directions coming from this one remarkable day.
Yeah, I really like the way you approach the story by picking specific individuals, and then each chapter is their experience at the battle. Was there, there were so many people that took part in the battle. How did you choose these particular people to focus on? How did you narrow it
Yeah.
down?
Well, the idea was to find people who were representative of a different aspect of the things that happened here and their lasting consequences and what they revealed about social attitudes of the time. So, some of the themes I knew pretty early on I wanted to focus on was, Holmes and, as I said, that line, passion and irony. And I'll come back to that. Um, the revolution in military medicine, um, the evolution of modern military tactics. Of course, it's a thing that's still hard to explain to people um, today. For all that's been written about this, I think it's the most common reaction if, you know, how did you get people to, engage in these kinds of frontal assaults? Why did they do that? And in fact, there was very good sort of, you could say, logical reasons, but it really is reflective of the rise of sort of military science, which was really, I think, impelled in large measure in America, certainly, by the experience of the Civil War. Um, and So, I mean, some of them were obvious choices, McClellan and Lee, in talking about different aspects of command and organization of armies. Again, one of the striking things from the perspective of anyone who studied modern military organization and military science is the almost complete absence of staff work that took place in this battle in particular. And you know, to our modern eyes, it seems almost incredible. But it was this, you know, huge change from sort of improvisation to professionalism that was impelled by the fact that, well, in part, no one had, in America at least, had commanded armies of this size ever before. I mean, the American experience up until then had been, you know, much smaller affairs. And um, Holmes's, you know, point about passion and irony, well, passion was we've experienced something, one of these remarkable things, which has set us apart. I mean, he wasn't ever glorifying war, and he was accused of doing that, in fact, a number of times from some of the speeches he made. And he hotly denied this to friends, and he was very angry, in fact, that people misunderstood him. But he said, this is undeniably being in a battle is as he said, it's like living life to the top for that time you're there of this incredible experience. And irony was, well, you saw how little men control their fate. The bravest people were the ones most likely to die. Plans always went awry. The disjunction between aspirations and results was brought home, you know, powerfully by the experience of this kind of chaos that took place in war, and I think particularly in the Civil War. But um, and it's interesting to me too. He never became a cynic. He didn't say nothing matters. He didn't say it's pointless. It was a kind of real practical courage and a real practical philosophy he drew from that, which is very reflective of, I think you can see this in the larger society. Some of it were changes that were already in motion, of a change from the sort of religious to scientific view, of revelation to pragmatism and experiment. But it was really given an acceleration by the experiences that Holmes, I think, described and put into words so well, which was what you can do, as he always counseled his old friends, was, you know, don't worry so much. He said, file in and do your damnedest. A bit of a military metaphor there, too. Be a good soldier. I mean, that's, he would even say that. That's what you can do. You do your job well and leave the cosmic, you know, consequences to fate. And he said, a man should have the same attitude towards failure that many have towards death. He said, do your damnedest and don't worry, the cosmos will collapse if you fail. And I was really struck in writing his biography of seeing how much this whole generation embraced that kind of view. Now, of course, you know, he qualified it by saying those of us who somehow survived. And I think he was referring to the after effects, because obviously, and I deal with this at the end of my book, I mean, um, obviously many soldiers suffered terrible consequences, not only physically, but mentally. Um, and, you know, this was another consequence I touch on, was the sort of recognition of mental health as actually part of medicine for the first time, and serious efforts to deal with it. I mean, this came in more in the decades afterwards, but it came from, you know, the trauma that so many had suffered. But in this kind of, you know, shift to practicality, away from ideology, away from certainty, even that Holmes embodied, I mean that Holmes explicitly described, I think, was something that you see in society at large.
So I think it's safe to say that Holmes is probably your favorite character in this book.
I don't know. I liked a lot of them. I mean, I was happy to come back and spend some more time with Holmes. You know, when I gave some talks about my Holmes book, Gene Weingarten, who had been the humor columnist in the Post for many years, he'd written a couple of books. I think one was about dogs and one was a sort of memoir or something. And he had this very funny column, which had come out just at the time my book did, about sort of advice to authors. And he said, by the time your book comes out, you will hate your book. And he said, this is a natural consequence of having read it 5,273 times in the whole process. And I quoted this to some of the groups I spoke to about my Holmes book. And I said, actually, I didn't hate this book. I said I knew perfectly well what he was talking about, but I said I actually didn't hate my Holmes book when I was done. I said, and that's not because I was suffering from, vainglory, but because I felt, I'd spent this time with this fascinating person, and I hated to say goodbye to him. So yeah, I did want to come back to him, but I found Jacob Cox a fascinating person. He was one of the generals you might have dismissed as a quote unquote political general, not a man with military experience, got the position because of his political standing. And yet he had studied the science of war more than most West Point graduates had. And he comes across as remarkably able and thoughtful commander in the battle.
Mhm.
Letterman is a fascinating character too. Clara Barton, I know doesn't come off very well in my telling, and I think her failings, her character flaws are, they'll tell a really interesting story about expectations of women at the time. Um, but you see, with some of it was an opportunity though to talk more generally. Well, what did the war do for the role of women? It
Mhm.
was hugely important, clearly. You had tens of thousands of women working as nurses, leaving their home in a way for the first time, and perhaps even more importantly, getting involved in serious managerial business kind of positions. The women who held important positions in the Sanitary Commission, it was Louisa Schuyler, who would go on to found one of the first nursing schools in the country, and she had been one of the managers in New York for the Sanitary Commission. And she said, the great lesson I learned was the power of organization, said something I knew nothing about.
Mhm.
And, I mean, I found that whole story very interesting too, and of the expectations of women going into the war. It was okay for women to engage in sort of charitable activities that emphasized the sort of traditional role of women, self-denial, natural caregivers. So, but anything that smacked of running things, of doing this professionally, that was, and that I think was the conflict that you really see acting out in Barton's, you know, um, troubled personality that she always felt she had to express what she was doing, not as I'm doing the same thing men are. Look, women can organize and run things. It was a reflection of these, traditionally Victorian feminine traits. She would always cast it that way and some of these other women who to me were much more impressive characters, like Mary Livermore, who headed the Western Sanitary Society Commission. Sorry, I kept saying Society, Sanitary Commission. Um, she was, playing a role that was very unaccustomed for women. And she describes in her memoir, very interestingly, some of her struggles with this herself. But she traveled around a great deal. Excuse me, raising money, working with getting nurses into the system and into the field. And she describes going somewhere in the Midwest, I think Iowa, and seeing women working in the field, doing field work on the farms. And now this was, unheard of in a way. Women took care of the chickens and maybe the dairy and the vegetable garden. They didn't do the field work. That was for men. But it was necessity. The men were off fighting the war. And she said, I was at first, recoiled from this. Here are these women doing these unladylike things. But she said, I noticed how well they handled the horses and the really neat job they did making the shocks of wheat in the field. And she said they were doing God's work. Um, and she herself too had this, to me, probably the most moving thing in this chapter to me was she and another woman had really taken charge of this huge fair that was going to raise money for the Sanitary Commission in Chicago. I think it raised, I mean, millions of dollars in today's money. They got Lincoln to donate a signed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation to auction off. And they were building these pavilions for the fair. And the whole thing was a huge fundraising activity to help the Sanitary Commission's work. And when it came time to sign the contract with the builder said, well, who underwrites for you? And so, well, what does this mean? Well, I said, well, we have money in the bank to cover the security of the cost of building the building, so you're not at risk. And she said, well, this illiterate workman explained to us what we didn't know, that women, when they married, did not control their own property. They had to get one of their husbands, to sign.
Mhm.
And she said, I vowed at that moment, when the war was over, I would work for equality of rights for women, including the right to vote. And Barton, interestingly, kept her distance from the women's suffrage movement after the war. And I think it was part of her wanting to say, I am the unique example of this. She didn't like sharing the limelight. She didn't like the idea other women were maybe, stealing the attention from her.
It is
I think
interesting. There are a couple big women figures at that time who don't really attach themselves to the women's suffrage movement. So
Well, that's
and I
certainly true. And of course there were complicated cross, political, ideological thoughts about that. With Clara Barton, I think it's pretty clear it was part of this, you know, the same, quirks of her personality or conflicts in her personality that she didn't want to, I think, feel that um, she was representative of a larger movement for women. She wanted it to be, this is what Clara Barton is, unique.
she yeah, but she also is on record. I mean, in her papers, she says, when asked why she didn't ally herself with, the women's suffrage
Yeah.
movement, there was a major split in the movement because a lot of the women wanted women to have the vote before African Americans.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Barton felt that African
No.
Americans should have the vote before the women. And she's quoted as saying, if the old scarred slave is let through the door of voting before me, I am happy to let him go, kind
Yeah.
of thing.
No, that's a very important
Um,
point and a very fair point. That was definitely part of what her rationale was. But and yeah, I mean, that was a complicated story, particularly in the South, where there you certainly see some parts of the women's suffrage movement being, very racist, very, much wanting to view this in a way as a way to not have to, enfranchise blacks. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. So let's see. So was there somebody that you wanted to include in this book that you weren't able to because of
Mm.
lengths or any of that? Was there
No,
someone
man.
that you wish you had included?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I conceived this as it's almost more a collection of essays than it is I mean, I it was a bit of a jigsaw puzzle to put it together because I wanted it to be, narrative and chronological and tell the story of the battle through these nine different people. But each of the chapters is really sort of an essay, a rumination about some of these ideas, and I wanted it to be short, frankly, and
Oh,
so
right.
yeah,
Yeah, one
yeah.
of the books we're going to be discussing later on in this series of Meet the Author is Scott Hartwick's book on Antietam.
Oh
I
boy,
Dread
yeah.
the Thought of the Place, which is
Right.
like, I don't know
Not
how many,
short, not short.
Not
not
definitely
short.
not short. Yes.
Also a workout while you read. So
Yeah, that's right. Moves it helps the old muscles. Um, I'm assuming you've been to Antietam.
Yes, yes. A few
Yeah,
times. Yes.
a few times. Yeah, and a lot. I've been
But
a
by
volunteer.
the way, both on foot and on horseback, I'll have you know. So.
Oh,
oh,
nice,
nice.
nice. I've been a volunteer at Antietam for over 15 years,
Okay.
and a lot of times we get people that come to Antietam and they don't realize all they know is Gettysburg. And
Hmm.
they don't realize the story of Antietam, and Gettysburg is the only battle they know anything about. Um,
Hmm.
which battle do you think is more important? Do you have an opinion on
They're both important. Um,
that?
I mean, part of what drew me to this treatment of was that precisely that, well, Gettysburg, yeah, everyone knows about. And but I'm not sure you have the same, coming together of so many strands of, consequence at Gettysburg. And I'm not sure it would have lent itself to this kind of treatment that I wanted to bring, and this kind of, looking at the the effects on society and how society had also shaped these people who were there, for better and for worse.
Right, absolutely. I agree. That the consequences of the battle, to me at least, are much more important in the war than the consequences of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Just the Emancipation Proclamation alone is
Yeah.
itself is, huge, huge. Um, so as just saying for our viewers, at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, one of the main stories that we tell is the story of Dr. Jonathan Letterman. And I thought your chapter was fantastic. And I understand you spoke to our Director of Research, Terry Reimer, to get some information about Dr. Letterman. And thank you for acknowledging her in the book. Um, I was wondering, did you know anything about Dr. Letterman prior to writing this book? How did you come across his story and decide to include it?
I don't know. Yeah, again, I can't tell you how I first encountered him. It may have been from visiting your museum many years ago. But it's certainly, I mean, as soon as I started digging into that, I mean, I was struck again by here's something that's a turning point in the entire history of battlefield medicine. Here, he's not only has he um, gotten the ambulance system organized in a way that had been chaotic before, but he's introducing really the enduring concept of triage of you when soldiers are wounded, you say, are they lightly wounded and can they, maybe just walk out of here? Are they seriously wounded and are going to need more intensive care, or are they hopeless? So there's no point in wasting any time on. Um, and he developed this system, which is still really the fundamental model of today, of where you have field dressing stations to provide immediate aid. You have field hospitals. His concept then was outside of artillery range of the enemy, but still close enough so that wounded soldiers can receive the life-saving help they might need in a reasonable amount of time. And then a regular system of evacuating from field hospitals to general hospitals in cities far from the battlefield. And I mean, the contrast to what was there before, I mean, it's just extraordinary what a change it was. That I mean, commanders tended to not like hospitals because they considered them a drag on logistics. They had soldiers, stuck in these hospitals, and yeah, we can't move because we need people to stay and take care of them. So the evacuation hospital system took care of that problem. If you had people needing care over a long period of time, they were out of the hands of the commander of who could, wouldn't have to face that problem. Um, One of the other really fundamental principles that he put his finger on, which is an enduring principle in organization of military systems across the board, is to have these important assets at a higher level of command. What had happened up until then was every regiment had its own regimental hospital. So inevitably, some would be completely unused because that particular regiment didn't suffer any casualties, and others would be completely overwhelmed. And each regiment jealously guarded it, said, we're not going to let somebody in from a different regiment. And Letterman's system was to have field hospitals at a brigade or even higher level so that they could be used where they were needed. Same thing with supplies of drugs. They had been supplied to each regiment. So again, there was, a lot that went to waste and a lot that was in short supply. You see the same thing, interestingly, in Antietam, and you see this evolution during the Civil War of uh, organization of assets like artillery. When they're in the hands of lower level commanders, they're spread out across the battlefield. Each regiment doesn't want to let another regiment have its artillery. If they're organized at a higher level, they can be concentrated where they're needed. And you see the same thing in World War II when there was the whole problem of close air support. How do you apportion that? Lower level commanders wanted to keep their own, small close air support to protect them. The trouble was that just divided it all into, as they said, penny packets that couldn't bring the needed force to bear at decisive points in the battle. So, but this is one of the first times I've encountered that in reading about military history, where it was explicitly recognized that you need to have these important, generally useful assets at a higher level in the hierarchy, at a higher echelon of command, so that they can be flexibly deployed and that the critical mass can be brought to bear where it's needed.
I'm glad you included the quote from the World War II
Yeah.
general about thank God for Jonathan Letterman every day.
Yeah, that was I saw that at the museum, and that was I thought that's really striking that here was this innovation, and here it is, 100 years later, it was still something, and even more. And this is something where I really give the credit to, the way the American military particularly operates and has their training and education. They're very history conscious. I mean, it was really striking that this, World War II medical director, Army medical director, knew who Jonathan Letterman was.
Right, indeed. And it's also important, and what we also try to stress at the museum too is how all of that transferred over into civilian life, how hospitals came to be, and they had their own ambulance systems that tended to, private citizens, and which didn't exist before the war, and all as a result of the success of this system during the war, and then civilians
And
actually.
that massive report that the medical department produced after the war is also a milestone in statistics, in accurate recording of cases. And one of the things that Letterman certainly pushed was to assign one assistant surgeon, in each unit to do nothing but take keep the records, case reports. What was this wound? Just where was the soldier injured? How was it treated? What were the consequences? And that statistical approach, I mean, it would be an exaggeration to say this was the first time, but I think on this scale, it was very striking that this was done there, and certainly was a model for the kind of, what we now call evidence-based medicine.
Right. The whole establishment of the Army Medical Museum, which was the big repository for samples of bones and things like that, and information on how wounds were treated, and that whole idea of it being a source of information for future generations, future surgeons coming
Yeah,
along who could actually study these cases. I mean,
yeah,
that to me was amazing that they even thought
yeah,
to do that in the midst of all of this carnage.
right.
And we still have Army medical groups that come through the museum. They're still learning from, the history that we're showing. Yeah.
Yeah, believe it or not, there are some medical Army medical folks that come through that don't know about Letterman.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
we're really happy to be able to open their eyes and say, hey,
Yep,
here is where you come from. Basically,
yep,
this was your origin story.
yep, yep.
So as far as
It's amazing you have his field desk there. Do you know how you got hold of that?
that belongs to our founder, Dr. Gordon Dahman, who is he's now a retired dentist, but he started our entire museum with his private collection. He had all of this stuff, and was trying to start a museum.
Mhm.
So a lot of his artifacts and things are the basis of our collection, and that desk belongs to him. So
All
we
right.
are so happy to have it. And it
Yeah.
fits right in with we also run the Pry House Field Hospital Museum during the summer months, and that's where Letterman was during the Battle of Antietam. So it ties right in.
Mhm.
So as far as as far as Letterman goes, was there anything that you found particularly surprising? Anything about him that surprised you when you were reading about him?
That's a hard question. I don't know. I mean, everything was surprising in a way. I mean, um, I wished I could have found more about his, family background, his own earlier years. There's very little, I think, out there. And he he wrote a report, and he wrote a book which was little more than his official report. I mean, there was a little bit more detail, but um, I didn't have as much of a picture of him, I think, as a person as I would have liked, and as I had for I think some of the other people I talked about. I think he was a very private man, it looks like,
Mm.
and he had a sort of, I mean, um, sad and uneventful, life after the war, with his wife dying young, and he ended up, in San Francisco, sort of as a minor political figure and not really succeeding at much. And um, but I mean, that's one of the things that to me that's always been interesting about war is that, I mean, as terrible as it is, it takes ordinary people into extraordinary situations where they often rise to doing extraordinary things. When I first started, I mean, the book I wrote about code breaking in World War II, I mean, that's a prime example of that, of people who did these incredible feats, which of things they would never, intellectual feats, they would probably, I mean, they might have done other intellectual things, and many of them did, but still, under these circumstances and with these resources and this pressure, they did these, absolutely phenomenal things. And one of the ironies too, of course, is for many of them, it was the most exciting thing in their lives.
Hmm.
Uh, and probably the most valuable thing in their lives that they've done.
Hmm. Have you been to our Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum?
I have not. It was
Ah, okay.
closed at the time I was really doing the research, or it was open very short hours. So I haven't had a chance to, yeah.
Okay, we're open on Fridays and Saturdays now. We just got a new site administrator.
Mhm.
So we're open Fridays and Saturdays. Can come down and check it out. We're sort of redoing how we tell the story there and
Mhm.
making it a little bit more interesting and adding more content, things like that. Were you aware of the Missing Soldiers Office when you started writing the chapter about Clara, or were you just aware of her humanitarian work and the Red Cross connection? Because a lot of people
Um,
don't know about the Missing Soldiers
yeah,
Office.
I was aware of it. And her biographer, who did a very good job, uh, discusses this quite a bit, and that was one of the significant sources I used. And it again, this is one of the aspects of her where her self-promotion got ahead of, I think, the substance of what she did. She certainly was a woman of extraordinary physical courage, determination, ability to do hard work, endure great hardship. But she also was a relentless self-promoter, always felt this need to exaggerate the significance of what she did. And as with it's a there are many figures in 19th century novels who are these great humanitarians who are inconsiderate of the people immediately around them, and there's something self-dramatizing about their hard work of, look, oh, I'm spending 14 hours a day on the supporting the missionaries in Fiji or something, and she definitely has that aspect in her character. And, the far more professionally organized efforts of the U.S. Sanitary Commission on tracking soldiers, they spent, I mean, tens of thousands of dollars creating a hospital registry, tracking where wounded soldiers were, informing their families. I mean, just dwarfed anything that Clara Barton was doing with her missing soldiers office. And of course, as typically for her, she had to do it all herself. She would personally try to answer, hundreds of letters a day. And I'm not saying it had no use, but it was part of, I think, this tendency towards myth making you see very much in her character. And, you know, when she was spent a great deal of time trying to get compensation from Congress for her work. And she was eventually given, I think it was $15,000, something like that. It was a lot of money then. And as some later observers who ran into, who were uh, dealing with her mismanagement of the Red Cross, looked back at this and it was like, yeah, she didn't provide any real documentation that she could have expended anything like $15,000 in running the missing soldiers office. And in fact, it strains credulity to think that that was involved, that a sum like that um, could have been involved given what she was doing. So again, to me, it's an interesting story of why was she this way, and also that she was ultimately out of step with the changing spirit of the times of this move to professionalism and organization, and she was still very much the sort of ad hoc amateur. I do everything myself. I arrive on the scene and distribute aid. I answer the letters from families looking for their missing soldiers. Uh, and that was just unrealistic when by the time um, with the changing world with its size and the need for professional organization.
Hmm. Yeah, I was surprised to read that because when in researching the missing soldiers office, we do know that she employed 10 clerks to
Yeah,
help her with the letters,
yeah,
answering the letters. They used form letters to
yeah. I've seen
respond.
the forms. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that she was dealing with, unlike the Sanitary Commission, she was dealing with after the fact, after the war, and soldiers that were missing, but not necessarily had made it to a hospital.
Right.
So, she just get, hey, Private Joe Smith disappeared at Chancellorsville. Help, how do you find
Right.
him? And
Of course,
obviously
some
the
of them didn't
hospital,
want to be found, which was kind of funny to
right.
me.
Yeah,
That they saw that they
that
saw.
record, that letter that you have in the book is something that I always read to people that visit the offices. I think it's hilarious.
Yeah,
Um,
right. Yeah, I mean, it was that I mean, more than a few soldiers saw the chance in the aftermath of the war to slip off from their families and start a new life out west or somewhere. And there was one, yeah, that she had managed to track down, and he was like saying, "No, I don't want to be found. Thanks very much." And she wrote him this sort of shirty letter of, telling him
she was
off.
upset because his mother had died waiting for word of him, and so she had heard from his sister, and so she said, you are obviously inconsiderate of your family's feelings, and I don't sympathize with you, but I sympathize with them,
Yeah, right.
and so yeah, she really kind of read him the riot act there. But yeah, I think and we do have the an original list of all of the roll of missing men that she put out. She published five rolls of missing men, looking for information about these fellas. And it started off at Camp Parole because she had access to all the returning prisoners of war. So that she could interrogate them and ask them, hey, was this guy in prison with you? Or,
Yeah.
do you know what happened to this guy? So that was basically the idea for it. And it kind of went on from there.
Yeah, yeah. I was just,
So,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I was just going to say, we're wrapping this up, I guess, where, Melissa, do you have anything else you'd like to ask or say?
No, I mean, I think a lot of people are talking about how you have a little bit of a different viewpoint on some of the aspects of these people's stories and give us a different view. Were there things that similar to what Tracy had asked about Letterman, um, uh, kind of the same question along the lines for all of the essays. Was there anything that was really surprising to you based on what you knew before you started the book and coming out of the book?
One of the things that I guess was something I hadn't really engaged before was the amateurism of the high command and the absence of a staff system. And in fact, it really was interesting to me because in the Peninsula campaign, here's McClellan, and there was a French officer who was attached, an observer. And in his memoirs, I mean, he's incredulous about it. He said, they have no staff system the way the French army and the Russian army at that point had, or had well developed. He said if there's, an obstacle, a wagon gets stuck, he said in the French army, there would be a staff officer on the scene who would be empowered, who would understand the commander's plans and intentions, who could on the spot change the orders to deal with the situation. And he said in the Army of the Potomac, there was nothing. It was still this sort of, practically medieval command system where there was the general at the top, and he'd have his staff officers simply be messengers who would be, gallop over and tell General so-and-so in this division to do X, Y, or Z. And so I had known this, I guess, in general terms, but I was really surprised how little there was. And here at Antietam, here's McClellan issuing not a single written order for his plan of battle. Never mind orders including contingencies of what to do if problems are encountered or if things don't go as you expect. There's nothing. And even 20 years later, when you see the first classes of the Army, newly founded Army War College, coming to Antietam and studying the battle, they're just incredulous at that anyone could try to run an army this way, and at how much had changed even in that short time. So yeah, that was probably in one of the big surprises for me when I really, again, I said, I had a general understanding of that, but I didn't realize how bad it was, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, and there was the
And it's
whole
not
thing
just to
about
say it's bad. It's reflecting
Right.
again the fact that it was this moment when there needed to be this incredible change from sort of improvisation, um, uh, this notion, well, to be a great commander, all you need is, sort of a natural leadership ability, to treating war as a matter of real scientific study, and particularly
Right.
the organization of military command as something susceptible to scientific study and management.
Yeah.
and McClellan had to deal with, totally reorganizing the army, and I don't think he really for example, you had all the corps, but then you had, Burnside's this wing commander, and then all
Yeah,
of a
that didn't
sudden,
help
oh no,
any.
you're
That
not now all of a sudden you're not a wing commander anymore, you're with the Ninth Corps, and then you're just shuffling these people around, and all the regiment, not all the regiments, but a lot of the regiments, green regiments, never seen battle before, commanders don't know how to command in battle, just a general mess
Yeah.
of things to deal with
Yeah. But,
organizationally, for sure.
in an important way, that reflected, I think, his failure of understanding of what mattered. And again, his model was the general in chief is running the whole show and somehow can by sending his staff officers to go and give orders and report back on what's happening. Um, his He had started to do some reorganization characteristically on the logistics side of turning that into more of something resembling a real staff organization. But on the operations side, never. And on intelligence, a real failure there too. He was essentially acting as his own intelligence officer, which is always a mistake for a general in chief.
He was dependent upon Pinkerton for a lot of that, and
Yeah.
Pinkerton not being a
Well, but
military guy.
as I think it was
Right.
Jacob, I think it was Jacob Cox who said, yeah, people blame Pinkerton, but he said it's impossible that McClellan would have been deceived except willingly. I mean, he was ready
Right.
to believe what he was being told.
He was always ready to believe that he was facing a force three or
Right.
four times
Yeah.
larger
He said the
than he
tendency
had,
to
for
see his
sure.
enemy doubled was what
Yeah.
he
Yeah,
referred to.
for sure. He had double vision.
Yes. Uh-huh. Well, I'm
Well,
sure
I
our listeners would also like to know what you're working on next.
exactly. Yes.
Well, I'm 67 years old. My last five books, I've said each of them is my last book. So it's been clearly, I'm unreliable when I say I've written my last book, but this may be my last one. As always, I have a few ideas kicking around, and if I get bored woodworking and volunteering with the Luckett's Volunteer Fire Company, maybe I'll have to write another book. But
Well, maybe you want to do one on the American Revolution, seeing as where you're from.
I've thought about it, but
It's the 250th this year.
Yeah, it's a big year for that. So there might be
like,
Yep.
some.
yeah, time flies.
Yeah, I remember the bicentennial.
Yeah, I do too.
So, all right. Well, I don't have any more questions. I
Okay.
think Melissa, you all set?
Yes,
Do you
very much so.
have any final words that
No,
Stephen,
no,
that you'd like to say?
no, no,
No,
thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you. You have a great museum, and it's an unusual thing, but it's more than just a niche. I mean, you really tell a fascinating story there. And I went to it years ago with my kids, I think not long after you opened, and I just thought this is a lesser known aspect, but even there, I remember seeing there's lots of consequences of this beyond
Yeah.
just, hey, look at the saws they use to cut off limbs kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I was
for
just
sure.
t saying today too, there's some historians, if when people say, well, what do you think, what if they would have had M14s then or something, what would the outcome have been? And they say, well, forget M14s. What if they would have had antibiotics,
Yeah, right, exactly.
that's
Exactly.
medicine really impacts the war so much. So sickness and
For sure.
medicine.
Yep. Well, we're working on a museum upgrade, so you'll have to pay us a visit after we get the exhibits upgraded and all of that, so you get a new perspective. We're telling a lot more in-depth stories of different folks. We're sort of doing like what you did. We're picking out various personalities
Mhm.
Yeah.
and featuring them.
Excellent.
Yeah. So come
All
back.
right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we
Okay,
greatly
well, thank
appreciate
you.
it. And we're for those of you tuning in after the fact, we do have, as I mentioned, we do have a day in September, the Battle of Antietam and the World It Left Behind, available in our bookstore, and you can also purchase online at our website, civilwarmed.org. And thank you for tuning in, everyone.